In the First Amendment, the Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. Well, those words of Justice Black from the Pentagon Papers case from 1971 rose to my mind when I was preparing for today's show, where we're going to talk about a journalist who was arrested for being a journalist. And we'll do that with a special guest today on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Wednesday, August 28th, 2024. And yes, we have a special guest talking about a case that we talked about before a long time ago and is now working its way all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. So we'll talk with the lead counsel on that case with a pending cert petition. Then we're going to talk to a very familiar voice to our listeners about another interesting case, qualified immunity case from the 11th Circuit. And she has some special news for you that we'll get to in a moment. First, though, I have some special housekeeping short circuit news. So as many of our listeners probably already know because it was public about a week ago, but you may not have heard, we are now on YouTube. So for those of you who like the visual medium and watching people's faces instead of just listening, half of our shows now, so not today's, but next week's and then every fortnight thereafter, you will be able to see us on Short Circuit YouTube. For those of you who don't want YouTube and just want to listen to podcasts like, old-fashioned days, that's fine. Keep doing it. We are not changing a thing. The format is the same. It's just now you have that option of the visual medium. And again, we'll be doing that at least for the going forward every other episode.
I have a question.
From the audience. Yes.
So basically, if it is a YouTube show, you can still find it on the podcast platform and listen to it when you're doing your laundry, right?
Absolutely. So for those of you using Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever, or just go to our website and listen, it's exactly the same. It will be exactly the same. The format will be exactly the same. Great content coming to you. But if you go on YouTube, you will see our shows that are video and you can watch the video. And then for the shows that aren't, you can still listen to it on YouTube. There's just not video there. Yes. So that member of the audience is actually my colleague, Anya Bidwell, who is a senior attorney at IJ. Now, Anya, she'll be talking about this 11th Circuit case a little later on. But first, she has something coming on in just a few days if you're listening to this when the podcast is released. So I think this episode's going out Friday, April 30th, 2024, but on Wednesday, September 4th, there's something going on in Austin, Texas, right?
Yes, I'm coming back to Austin to do an event with the Texas Observer on retaliation by local governments, mayors, chiefs of police, all those good folks, when they use criminal codes not to enforce the law, but to punish their critics. If that sounds familiar, it's because our Gonzalez case, Gonzalez versus Trevino, is all about that. So I will talk about that case, but we also will have Jason Book on. He is an investigative reporter who writes for the Texas Observer as well as other publications that allow long-form journalism. He'll talk about our case, and he'll also talk about his reporting on Priscilla Villarreal. He wrote several excellent articles on on JT's case. So he'll discuss what he found out when he was reporting on local retaliation. We kind of want to talk about this holistically as a widespread problem. Many listeners probably heard of the Marion County raid on the newspaper, right? That's another example where it turns out
in
that
Kansas,
the newspaper,
right?
Yeah, in Kansas.
Yeah.
Turns out that the newspaper was looking into the police chief. And the next thing we know, he's showing up with a search warrant and raids not just the newspaper, but also the house of the owner, as well as the house of an 80-year-old councilwoman. And there are many other examples of that kind of behavior happening. So we really want to talk about it holistically, looking at all these various instances. I have like 7 examples that just happened in the last year. So it's definitely not a needle in a haystack. And we also have David Gonzalez on. And David, he's served as a special prosecutor in many localities across Texas. So he'll also talk about how it should be done when you actually are really trying to enforce the law rather than punish people. So it'll be an all-around good discussion. And the good thing is that while registration is probably going to be closed pretty soon because we're up to our capacity, you can listen to it on Short Circuit. It's going to be a special episode of Short Circuit Live.
Right. So if you're listening to this right when this episode comes out, check. Maybe there's still room.
Yes.
But if you can't, we'll catch it. We will catch it on a very soon Short Circuit. And again, it's Wednesday, September 4th at doors open at 5:30 p.m. at the Parker Jazz Club in Austin, Texas. So again, check the show notes for that link. But now, our special guest. So I am embarrassed. I realize this is the first time we have on Short Circuit, I think, unless it was the before times when we did the show only from our headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, that we have had an attorney from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression on. FIRE, as many listeners know, is the foremost organization for freedom of expression in education. They also do a number of other areas of freedom of expression and First Amendment law. And so we are so happy to have JT Morris, a senior attorney at FIRE, join us. JT is a Texan litigator. He had his own firm there in the Austin area for a while. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt University and William and Mary Law School. And he joins us because of this case that I'm going to mispronounce, Villarreal, which, again, we did way back in the day, 2.5 years ago, Short Circuit episode 201, that'll put a link in the show notes if you want to hear, where this citizen journalist vindicated her rights at that stage of the case that time. Then the case went en banc. Then last January, the full en banc Fifth Circuit narrowly decided against her, and now she has taken her case with FIRE to the Supreme Court. So, JT, tell us about this amazing story that your client has and how it's getting to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony, and appreciate y'all having me on. So, like Anya was talking about, I mean, there's been sort of this epidemic of government officials behaving badly against their critics and dissenters and just expression they don't like. And Priscilla's case is a prime example of that. So I'll just give your audience a little bit of background about Priscilla and how we got here. Like you mentioned, Priscilla's a citizen journalist down in Laredo, Texas, one of the bigger cities on the Texas-Mexican border. A city who has sort of like all the border towns here in Texas has been marked by cronyism and corruption and bad government for a long time. And so in about 2015, Priscilla started down this journey of becoming a citizen journalist. She started by live streaming a hostage situation involving Laredo police, putting it on her Facebook page. The reception was overwhelmingly positive, so she kept doing it. As she kept doing it, her audience grew. She was exposing things about police misbehavior, about corruption in the government, and was doing it accurately, right? She wasn't making things up. She was just showing the people of Laredo how things were. And she started to gain trust, not only of citizens, but people in the government who would, serve as sources. Every journalist, every good journalist at least, has sources in the government. That's how they do their job. And so as she became, a more prominent citizen journalist, and as she became, as she started to expose more about the ongoings in Laredo government, many officials started to dislike her. And so they sort of endured on this campaign of harassment, harassing her at her job, pulling her in closed doors meetings and telling her that they didn't like her coverage didn't deter her. She kept reporting. She kept doing her job as a journalist. So eventually, they arrested her. And what they arrested her for was asking a police officer in the Laredo Police Department questions about two public events. Priscilla didn't coerce the officer. She didn't threaten the officer. She didn't bribe the officer. She simply texted the officer, "Hey, I have these tips. Can you corroborate this information?" The officer freely gave it to her, right? I think as Americans, we all know that's what journalists do. You go to a government press conference, journalists are asking government officials questions. You go to your local city hall, you're asking the people behind the front desk questions. No different than what Priscilla did here. But instead of simply letting Priscilla publish these stories, which she eventually did publish this information, Laredo police and prosecutors manufactured a warrant for her arrest under a Texas law that makes it a felony to solicit or receive information that the government deems non-public if somebody uses it for an economic benefit. In the arrest warrant, their theory was Priscilla asked the police officer for this information. The officer received it, and that Priscilla used it to basically scoop other news outlets so she could gain popularity as a journalist. I think to all our listeners, that sounds like journalism. Right? Unfortunately for Laredo officials, they turned that into a Class 3 felony. And so Priscilla learned of the warrant. She turned herself in. She went to the police station where the police officers were mocking her, taking pictures on their cell phone, posting them, to their social media, laughing at her. She finally got a really good criminal defense attorney. They filed a writ for habeas after she was out on bond, and a state district court judge down in Laredo held that this Texas statute was unconstitutionally vague. The judge didn't rule on the First Amendment issues. She did raise the First Amendment issue in her habeas petition. And so after that, we filed a 1983 lawsuit raising First Amendment claims, Fourth Amendment claims, and a civil conspiracy claim, and then an equal protection claim, arguing that Laredo police singled her out, alleging that, of course, all journalists in Laredo ask government officials for questions. That's what journalists do. And the only reason they arrested Priscilla is because she was more outspoken a critic than the rest of the journalists in town. We had of course, the defendants, upon getting the lawsuit, they moved to dismiss. They asserted qualified immunity. We had an hour-long plus hearing at the district court, who eventually issued its decision saying, look, I understand that Priscilla has these First Amendment rights, but I basically feel I'm bound under Supreme Court precedent to find that these officers had qualified immunity. We took it up to the Fifth Circuit in 2022, I think, 2021, right? So we filed this lawsuit in 2019. And so we took it to the Fifth Circuit on a 3-judge panel. We had a 2-1 decision, reversing ruling in Priscilla's favor. Judge Ho and Judge Graves were in the majority. Made very clear that this was an obvious constitutional violation. If the First Amendment means anything, it's that you have the right to ask government officials questions and not be thrown in jail for it, right? Whether you're a journalist or just a citizen, asking your government officials for information, right? That's just a fundamental constitutional right. We can't govern ourselves if the people we put in place to effectuate our government can't give us information when we ask for it. And so that was in 2022. Chief Judge Richmond said there was a dissent coming, but she didn't issue the dissent for almost a year. In the meantime, Texas intervened, and then they backed out and said, we're not intervening because Judge Ho, after Judge Richmond finally dissented, and Judge Ho issued another opinion saying, okay, look, I want to make clear, we're not talking about the facial constitutionality of the statute here. We're talking about officials misusing this statute as a way to launder an obvious First Amendment violation. So the state of Texas backed off, and then the respondents, these local Laredo officials, petitioned for rehearing en banc. The court took it up en banc. Texas jumped back in the fray, despite having no skin in the game. And so we had arguments en banc in January 2023. A year later, the Fifth Circuit overruled the panel decision in a 9-7 decision, held that these officers had qualified immunity for arresting Priscilla for no more than everyday journalism, right? Routine reporting. The majority really focused on the Fourth Amendment issue and the government seizure power. And basically their logic was, well, look, if the government seizure power, trumps the First Amendment here, which is sort of kind of backwards, right? And what they did is they first turned and said, well, instead of evaluating Priscilla's First Amendment rights and whether she alleged, that she was exercising protected speech, we're going to evaluate her conduct against this Texas statute that makes it a crime to solicit or receive information from government officials if the government says it's non-public. And so they went through that, said, well, we think they have probable cause based on the elements of the statute, despite, of course, the principle that you can't base probable cause on the exercise of an obvious First Amendment right. They sort of haphazardly and really reluctantly then got to the First Amendment issue, said looking at cases, said, well, there's not a case that says the government violates the First Amendment by arresting somebody for asking government officials questions, so there wasn't a case on point. So qualified immunity for everybody. And again, there were 7 dissenting judges across 4 opinions. Judge Graves wrote a great opinion dissenting, talking about the dangers of the majority's reasoning as to press freedom. Judge Higginson weighed in with his own dissent, talking about the dangers of this arrest warrant and how, the dangers of allowing government officials the ability to sort of manufacture an arrest warrant to then target protected speech. He also talked about how this was sort of a textbook case under the Nieves objective evidence rule, which IJ is very familiar with in the Gonzalez case, that allows you to get around that probable cause bar for First Amendment retaliation claims. Judge Willett, as Judge Willett tends to do, just wrote a scathing rebuke of qualified immunity. And Judge Ho ended it with a really passionate dissent, talking about how the majority's opinion treats the First Amendment as a second-class right, the dangers of subjugating the First Amendment to the Fourth Amendment seizure power, and the dangers of allowing government officials to shroud obvious constitutional violations with a statute that exists on the book. And so we've filed the cert petition with the Supreme Court. We are urging the Supreme Court to do 2 things. One is to find that this was an obvious constitutional violation for which these officials have no qualified immunity. And 2, also asking the Supreme Court to resolve this issue of whether or not government officials can justify obvious First Amendment violations simply by pointing to a statute on the books. The Fifth Circuit, in this en banc decision said, yes, they can. Other circuits, such as the 10th Circuit, have said no, government officials cannot do that. And so hopefully, we're hoping the Supreme Court takes it up. It's a press freedom case for sure, but I think the importance extends beyond that. Again, we're seeing this pattern of officials just misusing penal codes to go after their critics, to go after speakers they don't like. And hopefully we get a good decision that says, look, when a First Amendment violation is just well settled, you can't just use a state statute or a local ordinance to launder a constitutional violation and escape accountability when you violate those very clear and very longstanding First Amendment rights.
Now, Anya, IJ is helping Fire Out in this case. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
IJ has been on Priscilla's side since the panel stage. I think this is your all's fourth amicus brief in this case.
That's right. We've been there with JT since the Fifth Circuit's original oral argument on this. When JT, I think at the time you still argued as a solo practitioner, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So this case, and that just shows you how long it takes to do these civil rights cases. I mean, just think about it. We're talking about just the Fifth Circuit stage alone is essentially taking 3 years. Or it's, math is not my strongest suit, but it's right around that time. Yeah. So that's just, and the same with Sylvia's case, Sylvia Gonzalez. She was arrested in 2019. We brought a suit in 2020. Now it is 2024, and we're just now going back after winning at the Supreme Court to the trial level. So hopefully we can start discovery. That's how civil rights cases proceed, and qualified immunity is just one barrier to those kinds of suits. So that's the unfortunate thing about it. But we did file an amicus brief, including at the certiorari stage, and there we really made 3 arguments. The first argument is about this textualist understanding of Section 1983, right? And the meaning of under color of law. Here you have a classic use of under color of law, which is actually consistent with what Justice Thomas has been talking about with regards to his criticism of Monroe versus Pape, right? Justice Thomas really feels like Monroe versus Pape opened up the floodgates of litigation because all of a sudden Section 1983 under color of law is interpreted to cover rogue conduct. When government officials go rogue, don't follow the law, do something horrible like excessive force, and then you can sue them. Justice Thomas says, no, that's not what under color of law means. Under color of law means you actually follow a statute. And this is a classic case of, yes, Justice Thomas, you follow a statute. Under color of this statute, the officers arrested Priscilla Villarreal, and they should not have done that because they violated her First Amendment rights. So that's our first argument. The second argument is really about immunities coming in, and this it's not really new scholarship, but it's something that's been in the news a lot lately, and this idea of law notwithstanding, right? This little provision that was edited out of Section 1983's text when they were compiling all the laws 3 years after 1983 was passed. And that was just a scrivener's thing. It had nothing to do with them actually editing the substance of the law. And that notwithstanding language clearly means that immunities notwithstanding. So really, if you wanted to look at 1983 in good faith, then you'd look at that language and see that what Congress clearly meant is that immunities, even if they existed at the time, to the extent they existed at the time, should not be read into Section 1983. And of course, the obviousness point, we kind of zero in on it in our amicus brief as well, especially given that this was not split second type of a situation. Here you have plenty of time for government officials to deliberate, to look, to search the law books, right? In the words of Justice Robert Jackson, when he was then Attorney General, government officials should not be scouring the law books so they can find the law, first have a man and then find the law to put that man in jail. So that's kind of what we're arguing, and something that we've been arguing in the Fifth Circuit as well. Judge Ho found it persuasive, and we're forever grateful to him. Unfortunately, he didn't carry the day at the en banc stage, but hopefully his dissent and dissent of other judges on the Fifth Circuit will help this case to go up all the way through the Supreme Court. I think that you heard it here first, folks. I think the petition will be granted. I don't see how it can't be granted, given all the opinions, separate opinions in the Fifth Circuit.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Anya, but I think, when the court has overturned grants of qualified immunity on obviousness grounds, they've all come from Fifth Circuit decisions. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually, so the
one
original
was 11th Circuit, right?
The 11th Circuit is Hope versus Peltzer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the original one, but that
Taylor and
yeah, what are you saying?
No, I was going to say, but the more recent two have come from there, right?
The more recent ones came from the Fifth Circuit, and I think that the the Supreme Court was actually more explicit about its obviousness analysis in the cases involving the Fifth Circuit. The Hope versus Pelzer precedent, I think, actually has more to do with just, Justice Stevens very thoroughly explaining various, shades of the clearly established law, and he kind of in passing mentions obviousness. The Fifth Circuit cases like the Taylor versus Riojas case, for example, there I think the Fifth Circuit the Supreme Court is much more clear about this is an obvious violation, and it should be, and the Fifth Circuit was wrong precisely because it did not consider this obviousness argument.
So, JT, do we have a conference date yet for the petition?
Yeah, so it's looking like October 11th. It'll go to conference. The other side's response is due September 4th, and we'll get our reply filed. And we'll see what happens with it. Okay,
well. Stay tuned, everybody.
I'm hoping Anya's prediction is correct.
She's never been wrong before.
Bet on it. No, never.
Well, that means, you won't be wrong with your analysis of our next case.
There you go.
And this is Gilmore versus Georgia Department of Corrections, which contains one of the things we most like to talk about on Short Circuit, which is a Judge Newsom concurrence. But before that, there is the main opinion in a case where I am pretty confused how the court could do this. And maybe you can enlighten me as to what happened.
So Judge Rosenbaum, she wrote for the majority, and then she also wrote a separate concurrence that we can talk about. But the case is really about the understanding of clearly established law and what to do with that and how it really varies from circuit to circuit. And the case involves a strip search of a prison visitor. And this is a woman who's been coming to visit her husband twice a week for a very long time. She visited the prison maybe 50 times, so the prison officials are very familiar with her. She never provides any reason for trouble. And she is sitting there. She again went through security. She is in this visitor's room. She's talking to her husband. And all of a sudden, the officers ask her to get up, take her outside. They force her to sign a consent for a strip search. And then they proceed to strip search her in essentially no reasonable suspicion whatsoever. And they're strip searching her in a very invasive way. They manipulate her breasts. They order her to bend over. They feel in between her buttocks with a gloved hand. Their just details are, pretty painful. And after they do that, then they allow her back to see her husband. But of course, at that point, the conversation really can't go anywhere. She's absolutely traumatized. She leaves. And
they told her, if you don't do this right now, it's not like she'd have to leave that day. It's you can never visit your husband again if you don't let us strip search you right now.
Exactly. So they essentially force her to sign a consent.
Yeah, completely forced.
For strip search. And then kind of after the fact, they try to paper it over and say, oh, she had a smell of marijuana on her, all that kind of stuff. But there is no evidence that in the moment when she was going through this for the 50th plus time that she had any kind of reasonable suspicion whatsoever. And the question before the court is whether it is a Fourth Amendment violation to strip search a prison visitor when there is no reasonable suspicion, and also whether this violation is clearly established. And the 11th Circuit says there is no question that it is a Fourth Amendment violation to strip search a visitor with no reasonable suspicion, and we're very sorry about what happened to Mrs. Gilmore. But, they say, this violation is not clearly established, even though there are 9 sister circuits that held that you can't strip search a prison visitor without reasonable suspicion. And even though there are also other cases in the 11th Circuit that should have put a reasonable official on notice. For example, there is a case about an arrestee who was strip searched, and the 11th Circuit said, you have to have a reasonable suspicion, even when it comes to an arrestee. Usually with arrestees, there is probable cause, right? And they're saying, even when it comes to the arrestee, forget a prison visitor.
Someone who has been arrested.
Exactly. There needs to be a reasonable suspicion. The same with a student in public school. There needs to be reasonable suspicion to strip search them. And even border entrance. People who are crossing the border, the 11th Circuit says there needs to be reasonable suspicion to have this intrusive strip search. So those kinds of cases should put a reasonable official on notice. Forget the circuit court consensus. Those kind of cases alone should put a reasonable official on notice. But the 11th Circuit says we don't require officers to be creative or imaginative in drawing analogies. So we are not going to force them to draw analogies with people who are arrested, with public school students, or with border entrance. And then the court says, in addition to that, we can't really look at what other 9 circuits said, because in our circuit, there is a case where we say we're not going to look at what other circuits say. So because of that, we are forced to hold that the law is not clearly established. So in this case, plaintiff does not get a remedy, but going forward, plaintiffs will get a remedy. And then you have, Judge Rosenbaum, who writes for the majority. She also writes a concurrence. And in that concurrence, she actually says, oh, give me a break. We should be able to look at the consensus by other circuits. And then she says, and the Supreme Court allows us to do that, right? She cites cases like Wilson versus Lane. And she says, Supreme Court says you can look at consensus by sister circuits, and our cases to the contrary are wrong. Here's the thing, though. It's interesting because the Supreme Court is kind of not super clear on that either, right? So there was the latest qualified immunity case from 2021, Rivas Villegas. The court said, assuming that there is sister circuits can clearly establish the law, then we can do that. When they use that kind of language, right, then the Fifth Circuit, Judge Oldham and other judges in the Fifth Circuit, they say, listen, we read Rivas Villegas. Rivas Villegas says, assuming that circuit courts can even clearly establish the law, to us, it tells that maybe it's only the Supreme Court that can clearly establish the law. So I understand what Judge Rosenbaum is saying, and I agree with her, but I don't think that the Supreme Court actually has been clear about what is the role of circuit court opinions. It doesn't help when they use language like assuming. They should just announce that it can and be done with it. But that really is Judge Rosenbaum's decision, basically saying we should reverse the case that says we can't look at other circuit court precedent. And then there is also Judge Newsom's concurrence, which Anthony really wants to talk about. And Judge Newsom, he really makes 2 broad points. One of them is that he agrees with what the court did here, in that it announced that going forward, if you strip search a prison visitor, you violate their constitutional rights if it's not with reasonable suspicion. He says, I agree with that. But then he says, it does make me think that it kind of is a dicta, isn't it? When you announce something, but then it really doesn't have any bearing on the actual holding, like in this holding, we're actually saying, no, there is no remedy, then that sounds like dicta. And we usually don't like dicta. But in cases of qualified immunity, we do dicta. And then he's like, I'm not passing judgments here. I'm just throwing things out there into the, ether for maybe others to catch and deal with. And the second argument that he makes is about, the meaning of law, right? And whether law is a product of sovereign lawgiver, and if it is a product of sovereign lawgiver, then only really the Supreme Court can tell you what's clearly established, or the very circuit in which you sit can tell you what's clearly established. or if the law is not the product of sovereign lawgiver, if it can exist on its own force, right? And in that case, if the law is independent of some dude deciding what the law is, then you can actually have, sister circuits also, can take into account what they say. And again, Judge Newsom says, I'm just throwing it out there, folks. I'm just middle management. I think Judge Willett inspired that kind of dissent and concurrence writing where judges are saying, we're just middle management, folks, but we're just throwing it out there for justices to consider if they wish to do so. And one last thing I'll say before, Anthony, you can jump in, is that another interesting thing here too is that the plaintiff argued that it was against regulations, right? The internal regulations to strip search prison visitors in the way they did it with her, but the 11th Circuit, again, is not biting. And it's something that's been also kind of flowing around. It's in the water with all these qualified immunity cases, because very often what police are doing or what prison guards are doing is against their training, is against their regulations. And can it be that regulations actually are clearly established law? Does the existence of regulations mean that the law is clearly established? The court really chooses not to engage with us, just says, regulations is a no-go for our purposes. So we're going to leave it be.
Well, I'm now curious what JT has to say about this case, but especially on that last point, it very much contrasts with Villarreal, what we just talked about, where the law at issue, the actual Texas statute, right, enabled this conduct. And here we have a regulation that is supposed to disable this conduct. And it's like, it helps the government out on one side, but on the other side, it really doesn't matter. And it kind of goes to your point about Justice Thomas's point about Monroe versus Pape, that Section 1983 isn't supposed to be about officials who violate their own state law. It's about the state law itself, and yet here the state law itself again doesn't matter. Now, wait, I think Justice Thomas is wrong about that, and you can find out why in listening to our second season of Bound by Oath. But in regards both of the cases we're talking about today, I wonder, JT, among other things, what you think about what the courts are kind of dancing around there.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting contrast. I think just, one on what does a regulation or law, like what role does that play in the qualified immunity analysis? And then more broadly, how does that fit with Section 1983? It sort of puts, shows you both sides of the Monroe v. Pape debate.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I think if a regulation says you can't do this and an official does that, that should be enough to overcome qualified immunity, right? If an official knows that First Amendment principles or longstanding precedent says you can't arrest somebody for this, but they cherry pick a law out of a state penal code to arrest that person anyways, they shouldn't get qualified immunity for that, right? I think this just all goes back. Like, if you're acting under color of law, right, whether that's you're enforcing a statute in an unconstitutional way, or you're just going rogue, either way, you should be accountable if you violate the Constitution. And I think what this decision shows is just how much of a quagmire qualified immunity jurisprudence has become, right? You have three opinions here, none of which, they're all kind of, like you said, just sort of middling and saying, well, we sort of want to hold these prison guards accountable, but we can't because there's all these barriers in the way. I mean, what always stands out in these Fourth Amendment cases is when they grant qualified immunity, they're essentially saying the officers acted reasonably unreasonable. Like, that makes absolutely no sense. And this case is just a great example of how sort of twisted qualified immunity doctrine has become, and really let egregious constitutional violations like this go unaccounted for.
And I think there are just so many things like this, right, Anthony, that you're pointing out, all these inconsistencies. The thing about them all is that somehow they end up as an excuse for the government official to get off the hook. That all the time.
That's the common theme.
It's the common theme. It's like if one is on the one side of the ledger and another one is on the other side of the ledger, then it should be consistent in terms of the outcome, right? That in one case it's going to be plaintiff who prevails, and in another case it's going to be defendant who prevails. But somehow, every time it is defendant that prevails in those close cases where you actually have to resolve these kinds of contradictions.
So on Judge Newsom's concurrence, what I found really interesting, but not entirely satisfying, was his discussion of what, as you well described it, I think, Anya, the law, is it just that which is announced by judges, or is it something more general than that, something that exists on its own? And he says this, he refers to the very famous cases, Swift versus Tyson and Erie Railroad case, where the Supreme Court over the years has kind of gone back and forth on that as it regards the common law in general. Well, here we're not talking about the common law. We're talking about what the Constitution means. So he's saying, well, we are applying the Constitution, what the Constitution means as announced by binding precedent on the judges who are ruling. So here, the 11th Circuit or the Supreme Court, or is it the Constitution as announced generally by judges? It kind of doesn't matter either way, because it's still you interpreting the Constitution. And I think, I get he's just musing there, but there's something more there that he could, if he mused a little more, maybe would get to.
Flesh it out, yes.
Yeah, flesh it out. And unfortunately, I mean, for him, he's bound here. I think what it ends up being is that qualified immunity doesn't make sense under our system of government, and under the understanding that we have in other areas of law that the law, works, civil judgments work retroactively because courts are pronouncing what the law is. They're not making law for the future. But because of how qualified immunity works, he kind of has to accept that fiction. And so he's left in this paradox. But I think it's hopefully something that will cause more musing and thought-provoking concurrences in the future.
Yes, for law students out there who are listening to this podcast recording, these are good beginnings of a very important paper that all of us will be citing to.
Yes, just go out and write it. So, someone who's written a lot and maybe is taking a little bit of a break and waiting now is JT Morris, although he does have a reply brief coming up in Villarreal and his other cases, of course. But thank you, JT. It's been great having you on, and best of luck at the Supreme Court.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate the opportunity to come on and chat about qualified immunity.
And Anya, thank you once again for coming on. And you will be listening to an episode soon that she will be recording next week. So we will see you then. And for everyone else, thank you for listening. Please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.